Hey everyone, Aparna and Harinda here from Rethinking Tech. We're back with another quick 10-minute episode on something important that caught our eye this past week. Harinda, what was it for you?
This week, one of the things that's really important that happened was a company in the Netherlands that is important for the AI supply chain of hardware, ASML, has made an investment into a French company that creates an LLM called Mistral. And the reason that I think this is an important discussion is because there is this preference from the European side to be able to have some form of AI sovereignty, tech sovereignty, to reduce the reliance on US technology. But at the same time, you have the EU as an entity, but then you have all the nations within the EU that are also still somewhat competing with each other. And so now there's been an identity discussion about whether the Dutch investing in a French company and now becoming the majority stakeholder or one of the main stakeholders makes it now a Dutch company and no longer a French one. And this is really important because it touches on geopolitics, national security, and a whole bunch of other things that are all the hot topics in AI.
Ooh, that's a good one because I feel like right now the world is so divided on the US versus everyone else that I'm tempted to chalk this up as a win and figure the rest of it out later. I mean, I can understand why the French might be feeling a certain way. Right now, the French are probably feeling a lot of ways, just given all the conflict happening internally. I feel like this is not something they should be worried about. But separately, this is something that if the EU is really this bloc that is magnificent, as the European Union would want us to believe, then I would chalk this up as a win.
Yeah, and I would split this discussion because on the one side, when you compare the EU and their technology and the investments that are being made, they're just dwarfed by everything that's happening in the United States, that's happening in the Middle East and in China. But at the same time, it's still really important because recently we saw in Switzerland, they've launched their own AI that is sovereign to Switzerland. And at the same time, it's built based on Swiss data privacy and protection practices, laws, etc. And so there is this movement from individual nations. Again, Switzerland is not directly within the EU, but it's still a really important move because we're seeing that there's this desire to go in that direction. Having said that, I also don't think that is a very competitive move. I think that it was a relatively low-cost investment. Again, it was over $1 billion of investment, but it was a low-cost investment because ASML will not have the cash to be able to input to these large deals happening in the United States.
And ASML is an EU darling. I mean, it's what's keeping the EU even a little bit relevant right now in the AI discussions that are happening globally. So if anything, we should be furthering that. It's also funny that you say 1 billion isn't a lot, because agreed, in the grand scheme of things, it's not a lot. But looking at just the investments that the EU has made, that's a significant portion. I mean, you're lucky to get a check for €1 million out of any of these investors. So this is actually quite a large sum for a European company to be putting forward.
So I appreciate this point because in the EU, there's some movement towards being able to create this startup ecosystem that is enabling. So one of them is EU Inc. is, I think, the latest name, but it's this effort or initiative in which, because of all the countries that are within the EU bloc, each one has their own jurisdiction and their own laws. And so the idea of creating EU Inc. was to be able to have a sovereign EU entity that startups can start operating within, have some safe boundaries, but a unified set of legislation so that they can serve all of the EU countries. And then, of course, once you hit a certain valuation or revenue or something on those lines, once you've scaled enough, then you can start regionalizing to the local laws. And the idea behind that also was so that they would have an entity for startups to be able to operate in legitimately and easily so that the individual countries can also play catch up towards becoming more startup friendly. And so I think there's many initiatives in the EU that are happening at the startup space, in the tech space, in the AI space. But I also think when you zoom out, as you were saying, one of the things that's really interesting to be able to observe is EU a contender?
And it's the same way that we've previously talked about how the BRICS are all of a sudden relevant again. That bloc that was lightly starting to be formed, but then no one really talked about it and we shelved it for a while. But now that America's become so strong and is flexing its power, this response can only come in the form of a bloc or in form of many nations coming together. So the EU is already very well positioned for that. It can't afford to have internal conflicts. It very much needs to focus on the bigger picture, focus on the prize, figure it all later.
Yeah, I agree. And especially because we're talking about technology, but at the same time, the bloc is really struggling from a security perspective. Very recently, we saw Russia has flown drones that were shot down in Poland. And it was apparently the NATO alliance. There's a few countries that were named that were responsible for shooting down those drones. But the reason that that's also really important is because it makes part of the conversation about the EU and how is it that they're banding together. And we see this sort of fractured because we see some togetherness in some themes because they know that they have to, But then when it comes to safety and security and a lot of the military spending, etc., we're seeing it happen very unequally across many of the different countries. And so when I group this all together and being in the EU, I actually do see that this is one of the challenges, that the EU still hasn't chosen its identity. It still hasn't chosen its position. And now, because of these increased movements from the far right, I'm starting to wonder how long can they keep this up, because it's not a genuine movement in tech. It's just a few key players that are just poking and prodding their way forward. And again, this is part of the cynic in me, because people have been talking about the startup ecosystem in the EU being deficient for years. And so I'm happy to see this movement and some investment. But at the same time, I'd love to be able to see a lot more movement, a lot more enticing from the governments, from the private sector, because you have legacy brands here as well that are sitting on piles of cash that they could deploy to create this ecosystem locally. But we're seeing a lot of that fragmentation, and that's a problem in the grand scheme of things, especially into the long term.
Yeah, where is the BMW Innovation Lab and the Ferrari and the Ferrero? Come on, we should be seeing innovation in tech coming out of Ferrero. I think that'd be fantastic. I'd like to know how my tech can taste like Nutella.
It's funny you mention all of these companies, because when you were saying that, I was thinking one of the challenges is that innovation, as we see it today, is actually defined by the United States. And when we think about, cutting edge robotics and AI and all of these things, we don't define it in the European way. And so there's various narratives in social media that are really focused on, okay, we're not cutting edge, but we're European. And they're really trying to lean into that cultural aspect, that values aspect that is really important. The hard part is that the commercial aspect just doesn't catch up to that. And this is the place where reality has to meet the ground, in which when you talk about these topics, it's really important to be able to start seeing the returns of being a European, the returns of these values, because we're in a capitalistic world. And if you're not bringing those dollars or euros in, one of the challenges is that you're just going to get eaten up by the larger competition.
Both. Why not keep your European values and do it, but while innovating between the hours of 9 to 5? It doesn't seem like it should be one or the other. It almost feels like that's how Europeans console themselves. Like, oh, you know what? We're not cutting edge, but don't worry. We get to nap in the middle of the day. And yes, it does get very hot in Spain. I definitely took the nap. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Just saying it's a thing. And it's almost like a ribbon for participation. Like, you still got something. You're still trying your best. It's okay. You're Europe. You get away with all these things. No, you can be both. Don't let America define innovation and say it's okay, we're Europe. Let America define American innovation and let Europe define European innovation.
I really appreciate this point, and I'll tell you why. In the United States, there is, relatively speaking, across the 350 million plus population, what the work ethic should be. But in Europe, there is a spectrum of that. There are the Northerners that believe in this sort of high efficiency. And then as you go further south, there is this low efficiency sort of cultural aspect, the value of free time and that sort of thing versus the value of capital. And so you really do see this distribution going geographically. And at the same time, even in politics, you see this spectrum of values that is really challenging, because again, when you legislate, you need to come together and agree, and they can't. And so instead, they're getting pulled aside to the corners. And because they can't agree, it's actually slowing down the entire process.